Well, good afternoon, class.
Good afternoon.
Very nice to see you all today. We're going to be discussing trauma-informed teaching and how we can help build strong brains. This is definitely session 1 of a 3-part session. We're going to learn the background of how trauma affects learning, primarily today. It's a very introductory course, and then we'll chunk the other 2 segments later on when we resume. So, you have your devices, right? Y'all came prepared because you're good students? Yes? Okay. All right, so before we get there, here are the goals of the session. We're going to build a foundation of knowledge. So just building a foundation, again, just very introductory level. We're going to talk about brain science, adverse childhood experiences, and then resilience, okay? And then a couple tangible things that we can do as educators to help support those students, or adults maybe, okay? Next are our expectations and outcomes. So after you leave today, you should be able to describe the 4 concepts of development. You should be able to articulate at least 2 effects of trauma on the brain. And then you should discover at least 3 effective Tier 1 strategies for addressing trauma. We aren't, psychologists, we're really diving deep into that, but at your level with your students, there are a couple of things that we can do at the Tier 1 level to really support those students. All right, group norms. I know we're a small group, but a mighty group. We are going to prioritize curiosity over analysis. So just kind of take a curious stance on what this is. Bravery and discomfort, because something like trauma can be a little sensitive. We're going to assume the best intentions and have the beginner's mind. Confidentiality, everything in here is private. It's not shared out of this room. And then just breathe before speaking, which I think we all can do that just fine. All right, so why are we here besides the hour of PD credit, which is a bonus? So from the Tennessee Department of Education survey, 43% of teachers reported needing more PD and higher quality PD addressing students' socio-emotional development, and 47% on addressing student behavioral issues. I don't know about you, but that number is very close to 50. So that should kind of strike us as something very important. And teachers report spending 11% or more of their time dealing with student behavioral and disciplinary issues. Can anyone raise a hand if that is them, that they spend part of their day dealing with students and behavior issues? Right, so maybe this will help that at least in the way that it can today. All right, so let's see what you know. You can go and grab your device. And scan this QR code to take you to Mentimeter. If you're there, just let me know. Cool, thank you. You can go ahead and begin filling that out. It's going to basically ask you, what do you already know about trauma? What do you already know about trauma? And then we'll just take a minute or 2 and kind of share. While you're accessing that, I'm looking. There we go. Alter. That's what that word is right here. Sure. Thought that was interesting. Scary, yeah, scary was kind of what I thought too. And we're going to see that it can be more subtle than what we realize. And it can manifest differently in other people. Sometimes our most seemingly composed students are actually dealing with a lot of tough things that we're totally unaware of. And even adults, because it's been a coping mechanism that we've used for so long. Okay? Thank you all for sharing those responses. Get back into our presentation here. All right. So we'll talk to the person next to you. What do you notice in this picture? So we're looking at equality versus equity. For a few minutes to gather your thoughts and then share.
All equal stuff that doesn't feel right.
want to share? There's maybe one from each group, just something. Anybody?
Well, I said that if you take down the barrier, it's equal for everybody. Everybody has the opportunity to participate or to see or to do. So there's always a barrier somewhere. And if you take it away completely, everybody can do it.
Okay. Thank you for that. This side of the room?
Yeah, we were just talking about how, everyone is different. Like, some people don't really need anything, then some people need a lot. So you just have to kind of figure out where each individual person, where they are. So
Okay.
you can meet them where they are.
Thank you for that. One thing I remember growing up in teaching school was, have y'all heard the phrase, fair isn't equal? Y'all heard that before? Fair is what is necessary for that student. It may not be equal, portions or even necessary. Maybe there's a student that doesn't have a barrier, and that's okay as well, right? Excellent, but the key is recognizing them when they are there and how we can support those students. Okay, let's do some chalk talk, which no one uses chalk anymore, so it's marker talk. But you got posters around the room. You're gonna go wherever you feel led to go. These 6 questions are around the room. They're just in number order, but again, the order doesn't matter. If you really want to go towards the purple, because that's your color today, go for it. I do ask that you do put something on every poster, okay? And as you're going around, feel free to add comments to what has already been said, questions, wonderings, connections to other things. It's just really a mind map, just to get our thoughts out with trauma, what we know, and specifically regarding these questions, okay? So we're going to take about 3 minutes. So when the clock says 3:11, we're going to go ahead and come back to our group. So it may be something that strikes you more than others. This may be something that you don't want to linger on as much. That's fine. Maybe that one really hits you, but I'd like to hear something on each poster. All right, we'll go ahead and begin. I'm setting my timer. Let's do 3:13 to make it a little bit more even. So yeah, I should have said what the materials were. Apologize. We have the nice little marker cases there. As y'all finish, I'm just scoping the room, so camera, you're not going to see me for a minute. thought. I like it. Okay, because we are such a small group, I'll spare you like staying in front of a poster and, here's what I noticed. But I do want maybe two. If there was a question that stuck out to you that, you thought was thought-provoking or could give an answer, maybe you saw something around the room that you wanted to make note of, I'd like at least 2 comments. So anyone want to offer up comments?
Well, I think this poster is defining of teachers as far as success in your classroom, because if you don't get buy-in from students and they don't feel like you care, you're not going to get a lot out of them. And I've seen kids that, have had high level of trauma that will open up in my classroom, and I've seen kids that will just completely shut down depending upon what they feel, as far as you as a person, in that connection. So anyway, that's taken years for me to, when you first start, you don't always know how to reach kids, and you feel like, what can I do better or more effective? So that's been a learning experience for me.
Thank you for sharing that.
I think the self-care one has really struck more, especially since COVID. We're always, no, we got this, we just keep on going. And having that, as traumatic, I guess, as being home and away from our students and all of that, it really gave us that time to self-reflect. And so we had to learn that we can't do it all. Well, I did anyway. And that there's a breaking point that you were like, I'm sorry, but I can't do that right now. I need to leave the building, I need to whatever is being asked of you, because we have learned what that breaking point is for us, or for me anyway.
Thank you so much. Any other thoughts?
I think what you consider traumatic, I think for me personally, when I think about the pandemic, I had a lot more free time with my kids. So for us, it wasn't really traumatic, it was a blessing. Because we were doing kayaking, camping, things that we probably wouldn't get to do. But one of my son's friends, his father passed away. So it's like what was traumatic for him wasn't for us, and we view it very differently just because of our situations.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Great, and you all highlighted some themes that are going to be very prevalent as we discover this topic at length. All right. So here's some thoughts upon it before we dive into it. To make it more interactive, if I could have a volunteer read a quote, and then so 3 volunteers for this slide. So it doesn't matter who wants to start, but if someone can start at the top, someone at the middle, or someone at the bottom, if you don't mind.
Thoughts to ponder. When working with trauma-impacted students, we must reach their hearts before we can reach their heads.
Not all trauma can be avoided, and there is not a child who emerges from childhood unscathed to some extent.
Working to change a child's behavior when the root of the behavior is not really behavior can prove maddening for both the teacher and student.
Any of these ring anybody's bell at all? Yes, I think definitely connection between, heart and head is really key, which you kind of talked about with building that relationship. And, understanding that takes time to navigate. It's not going to happen overnight. I definitely didn't think I started building relationships with my students until really year 3, 4. That's just me, and I'm still working on that as I go. But yeah, and then the fact that some trauma, or not all trauma, can be avoided, we're going to see that too. Some it happens, and how we can best meet those students where they're at is kind of why we're here. So thank you all for sharing that. Okay, so here's where the rubber meets the road. So there are 4 concepts of development. So we've got brain architecture, toxic stress, the serve and return interaction, and then resilience. So we're going to dive into each of these topics a little bit more, and I'm just going to give you a reminder that these slides are definitely in your handouts. I know it's a little bit tiny sometimes when you're reading, but that's just there to help serve that purpose for easy reading. So we're going to jump into brain architecture first, because your brain really it's the foundation. Very much like the blueprint of a house, and we're going to see a clip that explains that in depth even more. It's definitely established early in life, and it supports lifelong learning behaviors. So that's the thing here with, building strong brains, is that there really is something going on developmentally with a brain that is impacted through trauma. And we're gonna see that some people, I'll say people, not just students, but people are carrying around way more trauma than others. Some it may have started with COVID, right? And that's their first experience of that type of thing. Some had happened years before, and COVID kind of brought things to surface. So the degree and the amount doesn't really matter, but the fact is it is there, and it does affect brain development. Second thing we're going to dive into is toxic stress. So in the early years of life, it can derail healthy development. So we're going to actually look at healthy stress versus toxic stress and how they're kind of related and how one impacts the other. Then we have the serve and return interaction. That's going to be kind of the move in the right direction to help rebuild some of the components of the brain that are affected by trauma. And then we have resilience, which we know is important just to be a functioning citizen. How do we bounce back? I think someone put the ability to bounce back once you incur a setback. It's the phrase, what if you fall down 5 times, you get back up 6, right? That 6th point is key. So we're going to look at these a little bit further. All right, so how are brains built?
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
Okay, so I'd like you to take 1 minute, either write down or just think about something that stuck out to you in watching that video. Is there one thing, if it's more than one thing, just one thing that really maybe captured your attention? It could be something you learned, something that maybe you reaffirmed. Back in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thoughts about this? Things that were striking? Anybody?
For me, just the idea of the serve and return and how much kids need that when they're developing. And during COVID, kids spent a lot of time on screens. And I wonder how that's gonna affect them.
Same. Yeah, we always talk about this.
I think what stands out to me is when they specifically said that kids cannot do this on their own. I mean, we know that, but as teachers, we also know that we cannot control everything that goes on when they leave us. So that kind of tasks us with well, if we know they cannot develop it without these things, what part do we play in that? Because that's a huge task. You know, we're not the parents, but we're having to throw in some of those pieces to get that brain where it needs to be.
Sure. Because teachers by nature, we want to help, you know. And for someone who, you know, has not been introduced into trauma, something like that can seem very daunting, you know, like how can I fix all of this, you know, but I think we're going to discover it really does start small. It really starts small, but that small start is very impactful. So, just to recap, the brain architecture is built early in life. It really is like the blueprint of a house. That's where everything starts. We're going to see in our next slide the development in a 3-year-old and the impact of a child in trauma versus not, and just how it legitimately looks on the brain scan, just to put a visual picture to what we are saying here. Okay, so what childhood neglect tells us about nature versus nurture? I'm sure y'all have heard of nature versus nurture before. It's a big debate. Which one impacts us more? Is it, you know, how we're born, genetics, you know, or is it more of our environment, some of both? Scientists like to do things like twin studies to figure things like that out, and really the literature is split on 50-50. Some really believe it's this, some really believe it's that. So what this scan shows us on the left side, you'll see a healthy brain. See all these vibrant colors, okay? That's, you know, the normal, typical brain flow, brain function, okay? This is a PET scan. Then we have an abused brain, and so these are two specific young children. They're 3 years old. The abused brain came from a Romanian orphanage, which up until the 1990s was very well known for being harsh, really poor conditions. So this child would have experienced intense amounts of neglect, lack of serve and return, okay? And so just looking at those two alone, very same age, how minimal the colors are here as opposed to here. Now we're gonna dive in a little bit further next and talk about different parts of the brain and how something like this plays out. And I think the word manifest came up earlier on about how trauma manifests different in different people. So that's just a visual to kind of show you what that actually looks like. So we are educators, right? So we're interested in how this affects learning. So here's another visual of typical brain development, okay? And then developmental trauma. Looking at these two pyramids, is there anything that is striking or noticeable or different between the two, besides the fact that they're inverted, one's inverted? Is there anything that is striking?
Survival.
Survival? On which side? On this one?
Well, I
Versus
mean,
this
both
one?
really.
Yeah.
I mean, when you think about it, working with students every day, you know that there are things that go on at home and that we don't know about, as you know, we've talked about, but you really don't know how much that fight or flight mode has to come in once they walk out these doors. And that this, even though they may be misbehaving here, this is their safe space. But it's still a survival for them. Like, they still have to have that fight or flight up because they still have to be combating something else that may not even be happening here in this building. So that survival is, I mean, that's just like, it's terrifying.
That's what struck me, and as educators, you know, we're focused on cognition. Like, oh, I want you to learn. I want your brain to be at high levels. I want you to be engaged. You know, not sleeping in class, all those things. But we see the difference here. The cognition. I mean, the priorities. We could say that's the least priority. That's the very least. Even the social and emotional is going to come before that, which back to the serve and return. So it's very interesting, very striking to see what priority. A child with trauma, how that really does play out. And then we think about, back to the other slide, you know, 3 years old, I think we're all parents here, you know, think about our own kids. What happens at 3? I mean, they're learning so much. We say that their brains are like sponges, right? So for a child to not experience the full breadth of cognition, right, because of trauma, we just have some work to do. So what happens specifically? So we have the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus, okay? So the amygdala, it activates the stress response, okay? So when you're exposed to toxic stress, right, it's gonna get bigger and enlarged. So it's actually a physical manifestation within the body. You may not see it because it's in the brain, right? But it's definitely there. You have the prefrontal cortex. It is, it's usually a checking point to the amygdala. It kind of helps regulate it, so to speak. And so obviously if the amygdala is off, the prefrontal cortex is going to be off as well. And then we kind of see it spiral into the hippocampus, which is a major role in memory and mood, which is very interesting connection. And if a child, a student, a person is exposed to toxic stress, we see that impairment comes in understanding and emotion. So they're, like you said, just trying to survive, just trying to get through it. The social cues and the pleasantries and maybe even the yes ma'am, no ma'am thing is not really gonna be such a priority if a student or a child is really revved up because of the constant toxic stress that they're exposed to. So there's just another visual for you to put things in perspective. Okay, let's look at this. So the hippocampus, speaking of, it's our memory storage unit. What do we notice about these two pictures?
One's organized and one's not.
Right? Like, that's in my closet right now. These are closet goals.
One of those looks like mine.
And with that, how does that make us feel? Like, when we're kind of in the clutter, when we're in the, like, how does that make us feel? Trauma alone, but how does that stress, right? I mean, you're looking around, like, I have more things to do now, and I've added on my plate to do. So if we, you know, even if we did not have trauma, even 1 ounce of trauma, it's a natural response to kind of feel stressed, let alone if that's day to day, minute to minute. Okay, so 3 types of stress. We have the positive stress. That would be, you know, presenting in front of a crowd, right? That could be meeting somebody new, going to a new place, you know, things that are different, that are going to challenge us, but it's going to lend itself to a positive result, okay? Then you have tolerable stress. So we have things like death in the family, okay? Maybe loss of a pet, people are really tied to their pets. So things that we can definitely navigate and work through, even if it's difficult, right? Because stress, I don't think, is really fun for most people. And then we have toxic stress, so that's ongoing. It's repeated. It's the student that didn't eat breakfast, who also didn't have dinner the night before, who also got yelled at by their parent because they were under the influence of something the night before, who may have to take care of younger siblings when they get home from school and your ELA assignment is not on their brain as much as we want it to be, okay? So that's kind of the ongoing toxic stress. These are things that it is really, the key word here is ongoing. It's the exposure. And that can come in a few different ways, which we're gonna see in a couple slides over, the realms that those cover. Okay. So we're gonna dive deeper into toxic stress and how it really does derail healthy development, okay? And I want you to just be thinking about anything that may stick out to you as this is being played. Or pause and then play. Sound reason.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Take a few seconds to write or think, and we'll just share a couple of things. Anyone like to share?
Just like that last, the nurturing, stable, and engaging environments, like that will bring down the amount of toxic stress in the, so.
It's encouraging, right? It's like, okay, there are some things I can do, and we say, just smile at somebody, and just, we really don't know how much those things really do impact other people. You could be the first person to tell them good morning. Some of us tell our kids good morning every morning all the time, but a student who's not heard that, or I love you, or I care about you, or you are loved, I mean, that's big, that's big. Any other thoughts? I'm sorry. I'll say, even for me, even when the heart was going during the video, I was starting to get a little tense, even though I've seen this video a few times. But it's just, to paint the picture, it's over time. And so the smallest thing can, as we say, set a student off or have them flip their lid, which we'll talk about ways to de-escalate that in our next session, okay? But, students who we say, well, you don't have a pencil again today. And it's like, if we can even just remove that barrier of a pencil, just have them provided for that student, that just might be the one thing to help them just take a breath that day. And I know this other side of the coin says we teach them responsibility. I totally understand that, right? But in terms of trauma and stress, if that can be something to help a kid out, I'm willing to do that. And so again, it can be small, simple also. All right, so we're looking at the rounds of ACEs now, which are the adverse childhood experiences. You got a little bit of exposure around the room with the posters. And so the 3 rounds we have kind of, in the graphic here, we have the rounds of household, community, and environment. So just taking a closer look at some of these, your household realm of ACEs would be like physical and emotional neglect, so things happening within the home, or like a family member, right? We have alcoholism and drug abuse, okay, so things that are ongoing throughout the household. We have the community, that could be poverty, food scarcity, okay, things that are going on around them that affect them also. Then the environment, natural disasters. I was talking with a student the other day about the floods of May of 2010, and they're like, I was like, too. I was like, I know, but that was a big deal for Nashville because that happened in, 100 years or something? So that would be a natural disaster that impacted a lot. And then the tornadoes in Maine not too long ago either. So things like that compounded with either one more thing or even sometimes 2 more things where students or people are dealing with all 3 types, that's very difficult. So we're going to learn some strategies on how to help them navigate through that process. So before we get there, 2 scientists worked on a study to figure out how adverse childhood experiences, to see if there was any root. Was it rooted in anything besides maybe just the environment piece or just the community or just the family? What was unique about this study, and for those of us who've taught in a Title I school, anybody taught in a Title I school before, which is where your students are 75%, at least free and reduced lunch. So coming from poverty, low SES status, things of that nature. So we might think of that as an adverse experience, and it can be. But what was unique with this study is that it found that the participants with these ACE scores, which we're going to look at in just a moment, were mostly white, middle-aged, college-educated, and insured. So what does that tell us? Like, it's no respecter of persons. It doesn't matter who you are, what race, what gender, where you come from, where you went to college, where you didn't go to college. It really can affect everybody. So looking at these numbers, we have a few, 75% at least some college to no college, kind of the breakdown of the races here, and then we have the ages here. But again, what should really strike us is that it is not just a poverty thing or a community that we feel is impoverished. It can happen to anyone. So I want you to take a look at your other handout, your ACEs handout, and it looks like this. I want you to just take a glance at it. Some of this information is sensitive because we're talking about trauma. I won't ask you to share your number unless you feel led to do that, but if you'll take a look at that. For every box that you answered yes to, you get 1 point. And at the very bottom, it's your ACE score. I just want you to take a minute and just look through those and see what your score might be. Have a number in your head of what your score, would you just nod at me if you have a number? Okay, and I have 1, 2, okay? Let's see how our numbers compare, okay? Number of ACEs experienced before age 18 by adult Tennesseans, it's just Tennessee, okay? 61% had at least 1 ACE, So at least one of those, okay? Doesn't matter which one, each one gets a point, right? We're looking at 39% had greater than 4. 27% had 3 or more, which is 1 in 4. So there are 4 participants in the audience. 1 in us 4, statistically speaking, would have 3 or more. And then we have the breakdowns of, 2 and 3 and 4 or more. Here's what that means. We talk about the lasting effects. It can affect our health, our behaviors, life potential, okay? And then we have people with an ACE score of 4 or more are twice as likely to be smokers, 7 times more likely to be alcoholic, twice as likely to be diagnosed with cancer. People with an ACE score of 5 or higher, so we're talking about the midway point, there 10, if you have 5 or higher, 7 to 10 times more likely to use illegal drugs. They report addiction of various sorts, okay? And likely to inject legal drugs. And the bottom one is what really struck me in doing this research here. So above 6 was associated with a 3,000, yes, that is on a typo, it looks like a typo, 3,000% increase in attempted suicide. Now, you don't have to share your number, right? It's very private. But I will say, in all transparency, my ACE score is over 5. So you don't know who in your life, who you're talking to, who you're dealing with, student, child. You really never know. You never know. But there's hope, right? We have hope. That's the good news, okay? Before we go on, I want you to turn and talk. Or you go across the aisles if you want, like church, okay? I want you to talk about what do your students or our students, what do our students face daily? What are some things that they face on a daily basis? Just talk, think about 1 minute. Just what they face. Just think about a child's day to day. What are some things they might encounter throughout that day or that night?
See, like, they still have to stay at home. Parents that, are traveling, they're left at home. You know what I'm saying? So it's just like, so even though they have that and they have the money and the means, doesn't mean that they're feeling loved and being cared for.
A lot of kids are taking care of siblings as they could for themselves.
I believe we've come to a good stopping point. I overheard a couple of things. I feel like me kind of coming over there might be a little strange with the smoke before, but I believe I heard things like routine, consistency, some things we might take for granted that students don't have. Y'all were talking about, give me something y'all were discussing over here. I heard the routine over here. They were talking something about,
What jobs that they do at home or.
right, yes, yeah, I mean, really, I think someone said taking care of other siblings, and that's a reality. I can't tell you how many years I've been teaching, and that's always a constant. No matter what type of school I've taught in, that is something. Or students that go to work for their family. I mean, that does happen. I had 1 year the student, don't say he was exempt from my first block, but he definitely got time to rest because he was working every night for his family the night before. And just kind of put that in your head, and like that was, the focus was work for that child, and he, a 12-year-old kid. That's a lot, right? Okay, so looking at next, the window of tolerance of stress, because we all deal with stress differently in general, right? And now we're looking at how we manage that. That's kind of what we're going to get into next. So, if I can have one volunteer, and you're not doing much of anything, I promise you, just one volunteer. Can I have one volunteer? Dr. Hughes, I see your spring. Okay, all right. Okay, all right. So heavy, light, medium, okay? Do you mind setting that on the desk right there and opening it up for us? talking about what our students face daily. I talked about what they carry with them, what they go throughout their day. Can you read a couple of those labels?
Yes. Parent has mental health issues, domestic violence, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, substance abuse by parents, parent incarcerated, poverty, parents ill, physical abuse, neglect.
Do you mind doing a quick count of how many there are there? 10. So their ACE score would be a 10. They would have checked the box on every single thing. Okay, let's just make some predictions here. What do you think their window for tolerance of stress would be? Would they have a very small window to tolerate stress, or a pretty good sized window where they can navigate through things and maybe don't get as flustered or as discouraged as easily? Super small. I mean, I would almost say non-existent. But that is a lot. And honestly, that is not an over-exaggeration, although in my heart of hearts, I wish it were. I wish no child faced any of that. But that is a reality, and you wouldn't see it. They carry it with them every single day, okay? Dr. Hughes, do you mind opening up the second backpack? And reading the labels as well.
It's much better.
Much better, okay? Lighter, a little lighter.
Captain Marvel, always nice to have. Okay, so parents getting a divorce and the dog died.
Okay. Would you classify the second backpack as toxic stress or tolerable stress if you had to make a decision? Toxic stress or tolerable?
Tolerable.
Tolerable, and why is that?
Because those are things that you can't do anything about those. So like, parents can get divorced and people or pets will eventually die, but you can get some coping mechanisms to kind of get through those things.
It's not ongoing, it's something that happened and you can move forward from it.
So one definitely seems more finite than the other, right? So again, that's a difference with the toxic stress, is that it is ongoing. It's like there's no end in sight. And the child doesn't know they're probably hoping there's an end in sight, but they do not know. So back to your fight, flight, or freeze response, they're constantly in that state because they don't know what's gonna happen next, okay? I get flustered when I can't find my keys in my purse and they're there the whole time, let alone a child going through several things throughout their day. So thank you, Dr. Hughes, for that, okay? So, very narrow window, larger window. Doesn't mean they have everything they need, but they have a greater ability and a capacity to deal with those things. All right, so to recap here, ACEs doesn't necessarily equal trauma, right? But they are connected, right? You can definitely be a person who came from trauma and still be a functioning person, right? You can have developed really great coping skills. You can, maybe you're seeing a therapist, maybe you have found a hobby that brings you joy, like crafting, running, exercising, right? So that doesn't necessarily mean that you're kind of bound for life to this, but the ACE score does reveal that it is there. So to pretend like it's not there is not doing our students service, okay? So ACEs are universal, but access to healing is not, and that's where we come in as their teachers, as their educators. So we'll further the point with this in the serve and return, the still face experiment video, which you will do for homework tonight, and we'll discuss that in next Wednesday's meeting. And so now comes in, how do we deal with this? How do we help support these kids? So like, now what, okay? We've all heard the phrase, kids don't learn from people they don't like. I think you mentioned that before. People don't really care how much you know until you know how much they care. We've heard that before. And that, this kind of paints a picture of why that matters, okay? So here's how we shift. We shift to a trauma-informed lens. Instead of saying, what's wrong with you? Saying things like, what happened to you? Or how can I help? Or I might even just say, leave off the to you and just say, what happened? If I'm dealing with the student, I try to, deal with them in confidence, so I'm not putting them on blast in front of the classroom. But if I notice something's really going on, that should be more of my approach than what's wrong with you, because what's wrong with you is very personal. It's kind of, you're already attacking them, even though you may not mean to, right? But to them, especially if they're already in a toxic stress situation, everything can be a trigger, right? Especially if they're coming home to someone who's saying that they're a problem. And now their teacher, who's supposed to support them, is kind of calling them a problem as well, okay? Doesn't mean they don't get by with the behavior, but there's another way to go about it, okay? So we're looking at some different things that we can do to support those students. And again, the specifics are in your handout as a better reference. So here are 5 steps to implementing a trauma-informed school. So we have the concept of the stress is coming from the outside, and then we can brush it off and say, it's not about me, okay? The first thing we have to do is drop a personal mirror, okay? I had an administrator who I think gave me very good advice. It's like, it's not about you, it just involves you, right? So days when we can take things personally, choose not to. Because 9 times out of 10, unless you really did offend that student, right? It's not about you. It's really not. Allow the student to de-escalate and regulate, which we'll talk more in our next session. It's never about the issue at hand, it goes much deeper. So kind of the iceberg theory, we see the issues on top, but it's a lot deeper on the bottom. And then the fact that discipline is to teach, not to punish. So we definitely want to hold kids accountable, right? But the idea of punishment or shaming them, could be another trigger instead of here's a consequence. If my sweet 5-year-old son, who did this recently, that's why it's on my mind, but if he draws on, his bedroom door and marker, there's a direct consequence, right? He's not gonna not eat dinner for a week, a little extreme, but he's gonna grab some soap and he's gonna help scrub it off, right? That's a reasonable consequence, right? So kind of matching like with like. So responding versus reacting. And I like to call this taking a pregnant pause. The key is pregnant, giving yourself a minute to process, because we all have emotions. And I'll be honest, sometimes these sweet babies can get under our skin, right? Let's be honest. So can people, grown people can, okay? So what are we gonna do in that moment to respond versus react? So a couple tools for our tool belt. Instead of saying the traditional, go to the principal's office, something like, I'm here, you're not in trouble, okay? You're not excusing the behavior, so I know that's hard to hear from a teacher mindset, but letting them just breathe for a minute, because again, coming from trauma, maybe everything they do gets them in trouble, and it's really not even warranted. Okay, if they're taking care of siblings at home and didn't get dinner done on time, and they're being punished for that, it's not their responsibility in the first place, but now they're in trouble for something that wasn't even their responsibility. So just being very mindful of that. Stop crying, it's okay to feel, okay? Detention is waiting for you, sit with me. Back to being their safe person. Maybe you are, maybe you don't even know that you are, and that's okay. But you could be that person for that student. Don't you talk to an adult like that, you're allowed to have a voice, let's talk together. Sometimes I'll just let a kid offload on me, and that may sound not great, but sometimes they just gotta get it out. And then come back later and it's like, okay. I'm telling you, 9 times out of 10, they apologize. Not by me warranting that. They come back because they had to get off their chest. Maybe no one's even listening to them at home. Who's really sitting at the table having dinner talk and eating around the dinner table and talking about your day? Some people are, some aren't. Some kids have never had that experience. So is someone even listening to them? Do they feel heard in their own household? Are they behaving in class and disrupting in class because they don't feel heard? Again, not excusing it, but how can we reframe it? If you're old enough to handle this on your own, let's handle this together. Okay, so just some ways to reframe our lens. And we're going to conclude with asking yourself the right questions. Okay, what is really driving my students' behavior? And again, it's not our job to be the psychologist, right? But can we do our small part to make them feel validated, feel valued, feel heard? Okay, so we think about what can I do at this moment to improve my relationship with this student? It's kind of like, do we need to be right all the time? Or maybe is trying to salvage that relationship the better move? I know that's hard because teachers like control, and I get it, and I'm very black and white, so I'm preaching to myself. But sometimes letting go the need to be right versus the restoration of that student, one of them is just higher. Okay. Okay, so here's a recap. We have our brain architecture. Again, we talked about the brain is, it's built in the womb, but then as it progresses, it is truly the foundational functioning piece for the rest of the body. The toxic stress over time can definitely help delay development. Serve and return is important back to relationships. And then resilience. And so over time, these students will build resilience. They will. And it's not gonna happen overnight. Most things that will require resilience don't, because then you would call it resilience. Just be, you got over it, right? So, but we can actually partner with them and help them to be successful. So, here's your exit ticket. It's Padlet. It's not French, Padlet. It's Padlet. The T got chopped off somehow. And I'm gonna chart our responses here. So our closing thoughts on the Padlet. Make sure you're on the correct one. What excites you or what concerns you? What wonderings are you left with?
Sure as well.
And then were any needs met?
We can't get in.
We can't get in. Reiterate, it does say choose one. So you don't have to answer all three. It does say choose one. If your overachiever did 3, beautiful. But just one, if you want to answer more than one, that's absolutely fine. I just wanted to limit it to one. That's great. We'll address part of the helping them overcome in our next session. Feel free to take a gander, see how our thoughts align. That's it.